from the vault, high atop the pastoral center of the Diocese of Camden, you're listening to Talking Catholic.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Walsh, your host of Talking Catholic. And since you're listening to my voice first, you know something is a little different. However, don't fret, my beloved co-host Mary McCusker is here too. But I wanted to open the show a little differently today. As I'm sure you know, October is Respect Life Month, a time period dedicated to providing reminders and insights to the Catholic faithful and all people to help them understand, value, and become engaged with building a culture that cherishes every human life. Of course, paramount to respect life is the right to life, the realization that all life is sacred, from conception to natural death. I'm sure I don't need to tell our listeners that as Catholics, we must continue to advocate for the unborn first and foremost. The Catholic Church is the church of life, always. We protect life, we cherish life, we nurture life, and to do any less is an affront to God. And once life is created, we must follow Scripture, tradition, and the teaching of the Church to ensure every life retains the dignity with which it inherently deserves. With this in mind, I'd like to read your reflection about Respect Life, which is far more eloquent than I can muster. This was promulgated earlier this year by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. 25 years ago, Pope John Paul II wrote that the gospel of life is the heart of Jesus' saving message to the world. In taking on human flesh, dwelling among us, and sacrificing his very life for our redemption, Christ reveals the profound dignity of every human person. This God-given dignity does not change with our stage of life, abilities, level of independence, or any other varying circumstance. Rather, it is rooted in the permanent fact that each of us is made in the image and likeness of God, created to share in the very life of God himself. The human person is a manifestation of God in the world, a sign of his presence, a trace of his glory, and we must reflect the truth in how we act and how we treat each other. The truth of the gospel of life is at the foundation of who we are as followers of Christ. In his earthly life, Jesus provided the perfect model for how we are to love our neighbor and live out the gospel call. Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me. Jesus calls of us to care for the other as a person for whom God has made us responsible. The gospel of life is intrinsic to the whole Christian life and foundational to the decisions we make on a daily basis. For the gospel of God's love for man, the gospel of the dignity of the person, and the gospel of life are a single and indivisible gospel. In his encyclical on the gospel of life, Pope John Paul II recognizes the full range of threats against human life, from poverty and malnutrition to murder and war. He places particular emphasis, however, on threats to life at its beginning and end, precisely when it is most in need of protection. In modern times, children in their mother's wombs and those approaching the end of their lives are certainly among the least of these in our world's estimation. Practices such as abortion and assisted suicide tragically reject the truth that human life is always to be cherished and defended with loving concern. As the Church celebrates the 25th anniversary of Pope John Paul II's prophetic encyclical, let us reflect on how we personally live out the gospel. Do I talk about and act towards others as I would talk about and treat Jesus himself? Do I inform myself of the Church's teachings and engage in the civic arena as first a follower of Christ? Do I support and advocate for laws and policies that protect and defend human life? Do I help pregnant and parenting mothers in need? Am I ready to support a loved one nearing death? Through the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe, may our Lord grant us the grace to truly and courageously live his gospel of life. So before we move on to the interview for the day, I'd like you to please pray with me for the following intercessions. And as always, we answer, Lord, hear our prayer. That during this Respect Life Month and every month, our resolve will be strengthened to cherish and protect the gift of every human life. We pray to the Lord. That the life of every person, from conception to natural death, will be protected in our laws and cherished in our hearts. We pray to the Lord. For women and men suffering after abortion, may the Church's abortion healing ministry, Project Rachel, help them find peace and healing through Christ's endless mercy. We pray to the Lord. For those nearing the end of life, may they receive care that respects their dignity and protects their lives as they place their hope in the promise of eternal life. We pray to the Lord. May God grant us the wisdom and courage to lovingly protect his gift of human life at every stage, in sickness and in health. We pray to the Lord. Amen. As you have heard, there's a great deal of thought and teaching related to Respect Life. Some of it may seem quite obvious, and other parts may require softening our hearts to those among us who deserve not only our respect, but our help. Now let me transition to our chat for today. October is a fully packed month when it comes to cultural initiatives, including the aforementioned Respect Life. There's also Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and one other cause that I'm sad to report often comes in third on the list of awareness initiatives in the United States: Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The latter, our topic for today, is one of my personal causes and certainly falls directly under the umbrella of Respect Life Month. Many years ago, when I was a newly minted PR guy, I worked for an organization called Volunteers of America. They had a variety of programs: homeless shelters, halfway houses, behavioral health homes. But it was their domestic violence initiative for both victims and batterers that drew my attention. Domestic violence is an often misunderstood and hidden part of our society. So I wanted to bring in some experts far wiser than me to talk about it. And who better to ask about those experts than our chief wrangler of Catholic Charities and my beloved co-host, Mary McCusker. Hey, Mary, how you doing?
I'm all right, Mike. It's so different to hear you. It sounds like I'm in church listening to somebody, reading the gospel.
I know.
But that was very nice to open up that way.
For anyone who's listening, I'm sure you noticed, man, I think he's reading off a script. Yes, I had to actually script that because as any of our listeners know, that I'm more than capable of going down a digression when we do these things. But I wanted to be very focused when I talk about Respect Life. It's we've had a lot of podcast episodes this month, and unfortunately, just because of how the scheduling worked, we weren't able to do a Respect Life Month podcast earlier in the month. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't give it short shrift as we get to the end of the month, and I really wanted to make sure we focused on it. So, and Catholic Charities here is certainly doing its job, because as I've just walked into the place and I see that everybody's decked out in purple, the color of domestic violence.
It's true, and it's funny what you mentioned about October really being packed full of different initiatives. I was just this morning scrolling through Facebook, and unfortunately today it was the aftermath of the presidential debate. The Eagles lost, but throughout
the Eagles won. It just felt like a loss.
Oh, well, I didn't watch it, so but there was a lot of anger today. But my point is, throughout all of October, you see all these different initiatives, just like you mentioned, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, another Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, and just seeing kind of this outpour on social media of people sharing their own personal stories, sharing the stories of others, sharing resources. It really just seeing, one, the awareness being raised, two, kind of the rally it creates. People realize, okay, I'm not alone, and it's just so eye-opening to read and see some of these stories. And like you said, we had World Mental Health Day, Mental Illness Awareness Week. I mean, I'm looking at a list in front of me, and there must be 50 different, awareness topics.
And all of them, valuable and important initiatives, which is, I think, one of the reasons why long ago I got into the habit of focusing on domestic violence, because I knew it tended to be a topic that people didn't necessarily feel comfortable talking about. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to, bring some light to it.
And here we are with two people who I can't think of any better people to talk about this subject. One of them is glaring at me right now, but I'm really happy to introduce my colleagues who do so much here and are very knowledgeable about domestic violence, among many other things. So Sylvia Loumeau and Jose Sanchez, welcome. Can I ask both of you just to introduce yourselves with your titles, because I always mess up the titles here, and both of you wear so many hats. So Sylvia, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, thanks. So my name is Sylvia Loumeau. I'm Director of Clinical and Social Work Services for Catholic Charities, which means I oversee our counseling services, including our Project Rachel ministry, and our Family and Community Center, as well as our Welfare to Work programs.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Jose Sanchez. I am a program director. I am the coordinator of the Community Resource Warehouse, and I usually take on a couple of other hats around here.
A lot more than that.
A couple of other hats around here, and as Mike said, there's experts, but I don't consider myself an expert. I just know that I know a little bit of something I'd like to share with it.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks
I appreciate
for joining.
it. Yeah. So let's talk about domestic violence a little bit, because I think it's often misunderstood. That I think a lot of people don't recognize, what it's like might not even recognize what domestic violence is. So maybe that's the best way to start, Sylvia, is by classifying it. So when we think of domestic violence, what is it we're talking about?
Yeah. So first of all, domestic violence is a broad category, and we can put anybody that's living kind of in the same household where violence exists, kind of falls under the umbrella of domestic violence. But usually when we think about domestic violence, what we really think about is intimate partner violence. One partner, one spouse against the other. And in our culture, typically it's a male abuser against a female victim. However, it goes well beyond just the physical violence. Domestic violence really refers to a pattern of intimidation and power and control, to get a less powerful person in the relationship to behave in a particular way. Physical violence can be used in order to accomplish that. However, intimidation, so threats of violence, where violence never actually takes place, but is influential enough to alter someone's behavior. Demeaning someone, calling them names, saying things that are designed to impact their self-esteem, falls under that. Blocking access to resources, financial resources in particular, is also part of that pattern of intimidation. And some things that we don't often think about in terms of more vulnerable populations like immigrants and refugees is threatening to withhold access to a green card or, to have them deported, things that instill fear on their part.
And Sylvia, you mentioned that, under this big umbrella, I think you said it was intimate partner. I can't remember exactly what the label was, but when we hear domestic violence, how much does that word domestic mean in this situation? Is this all family members that we're talking about, kids, parents? Can you talk a little bit about the different relationships that, experience this?
Yeah, when we're looking at it in terms of legal impact, anyone that's living in the same household, that's in a domestic relationship, when there's violence from one person to another, that actually technically qualifies as domestic violence. So it is possible for a parent, say, to petition the courts for a restraining order or something against a child that might be harming them or what have you. But generally, the term when we think about it generally refers to partner violence, intimate partner violence. And we use the term intimate partner violence too to be inclusive of same-sex relationships where domestic violence also exists.
Sure. And I know, and Jose, what is your tie-in to this topic? I know that it's something you're very passionate about. You brought in all these buttons and ribbons for us to wear at Catholic Charities today, and I know you've had a lot of experience with this. So can you share with us?
Yes. You're welcome for the buttons. I didn't bring the ribbons.
Oh.
So my part in this as a male, a Latino male. So one of the things that I like to share with people is that I've been a little bit trained so I can know and talk a little bit about domestic violence. But one of the things that I pride myself in is being, as a Latino male, making sure that other Latino males or minority males are able to understand that this isn't accepted. In lots of cultures, whatever happens in the house has to stay in the house, and it stays in the house, and it doesn't matter who else either going to work or anything like that. That is a silent secret that families and actually children also keep. So they are taught not to talk about that. So one of the things that I talk about when I'm speaking to a congregation or in a parish is that it is okay for men to talk about domestic violence. It is okay for men to support other men that are against domestic violence, and sometimes to call them out when there's somebody that's being demeaning to a person or saying something that's off. So once we're able to do that, and once meaning men are able to start calling people out, I think that's going to really bring it down a little bit more.
So I'm curious, over the years, is this a topic that you think has, it's like you said, people keep secrets. Has the stigma kind of been lifted over recent years? Do you think there's still a stigma attached to it now? I know you both have been doing this a long time. I'm just curious about kind of the evolution of, what we think of and what the general public thinks of.
So I think there were some changes in laws in the early 90s that started to have some positive impact on the issue of domestic violence and to make it a less acceptable I want to say activity, but that's probably not the best term. But even still to this day, it's a difficult thing for people to talk about because it's viewed as a personal matter, a private, household matter, or between spouses, and so, it's difficult for pastors or just friends to feel like they have the ability to be influential or have a say in the matter because it's still considered such a personal thing.
Right. And we do hear so often, every marriage or everyone has their problems and we don't know what happens behind closed doors. And right, we don't know what happens behind closed doors. And that must...
So one of the things that I think we can do all the promotions and everything and bringing awareness to this topic on board, but the reality is that there's always going to be a certain group of people that keep it quiet for a number of reasons. And one, in the minority categories, is that the male might have some sort of offense in the background. The police are called, and then that's another individual that's going to be arrested. And then that generates even more family trauma because there's another male in the criminal justice system. And then it creates lots of tension within the families that are there. So there's always going to be some group of people that are going to keep it behind closed doors. One of the good things that has happened during the years is that the police department is more aware of how to deal with domestic violence incidents, and they're getting better trained for it, so they're able to separate the couples and ask questions that maybe a female might not want to answer while the male intimidator is there or perpetrator is there. So those are things that are a plus. And that there's counseling being made available to both the perpetrator and the survivor. So I think that those are plus, but changes are going to take a long time.
Right. And so when we hear about domestic violence, what are some misconceptions? Like, what actions fall under that category? You know, just speaking personally, before I researched more about this, I pictured one person hitting another person. But from my understanding, it's more than that. So, you know, can we talk a little bit about, you know, what exactly is included in that?
Yeah, and Sylvia, you sort of started to go down that path a little bit earlier. I think, and you mentioned this before, that it's hard for people to kind of picture exactly what that is. You know, I think one of the questions I have, you know, sort of dovetailing with what Mary was asking, you know, has the nature of domestic violence, it's going to sound like a strange question, has the nature of domestic violence changed over the last couple of years? Like, what are people being differently violent to each other?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I mean, you know, just kind of going back to the use of intimidation and, you know, part of domestic violence is like pursuing a victim, you know, in order to try to curtail activities, right? So cell phones have had a big impact because now you can track kind of where people go, and so you know, we've heard some victims find out kind of after the fact that an app has been like placed on their devices to track their whereabouts and things like that. So I guess it's changed in that respect, but the kind of the nature of the behavior still, you know, like it's still an attempt to intimidate and control someone's whereabouts, and that hasn't changed.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that you know, Jose talked earlier about how, you know, there's a nature of, you know, in certain cultures where this is problematic because it creates a ripple effect, right?
There's definitely an intersectionality between like the micro and the macro.
Yeah.
Right. So what's happening in the micro level, the family situation, the family home, has a larger impact on the larger culture and vice versa. So it is, you know, I'm glad that Jose mentioned that, you know, how we look at minority populations also influences the police response and the legal response,
right.
Which, you know, is different.
So let's talk about it from a programmatic perspective. You know, so I mentioned before, I have a history with domestic violence programs, not as a participant, but as someone who marketed them. You know, I had the benefit of working for a company that had a number of programs for victims, and including some programs for offenders as well. But that was quite a while ago, and I admit that I'm not as tied in as I used to be. What kind of programming is available for victims and perpetrators now?
Well, at Catholic Charities, you know, we have a small outpatient counseling program, and unfortunately, a large percentage of the clients that we see are victims of domestic violence. So we're able to work with victims and perpetrators as well in our outpatient program on an individual basis. We do evaluations for perpetrators, oftentimes for the courts, to let the courts know our opinion about whether this person continues to be a risk to the victim. But in the our community, there are many resources. So every county has a domestic violence shelter that victims can go to. Although during the pandemic, there was reduced capacity, but there was also an increased need. So they were experiencing some difficulty in being able to accommodate all those that needed it. But there is a shelter in every county that people can access. There are, various coalitions, and Volunteers of America continues to do a really great job working with batterers. They have a batterers intervention program.
And I'll be sure to post all these resources too, so our listeners can hear and have
excellent.
access to them.
We'll make sure that they're in the show notes and on our social media pages as well. The actually, Mary, you want to ask something?
Oh yeah. So both of you have spoken, I know, to many, many victims of domestic violence. And what are some of the common things that you hear? Do people tend to minimalize or trivialize what they've experienced? Are they not aware at all of what's happening to them? Can you talk a little bit about, your personal conversations with some of them? Jose, I know I recently talked to you about this and conversations you've had with people.
Right. And so what happens is that when we're having, let's say, for example, a conversation with a female, and we're dealing with one now, is that the female become protective of their half or the other half. And then saying like, well, you don't understand where he's coming from, or you don't get enough time to talk to him. And I know this, so we can change it, and we can do it. But then what's really happening there is that one could be the strongest female in the world. And slowly but surely, this individual is manipulating conversations that it turns out that the female start being diminished a little bit at a time. And then in a year's time, this female doesn't think really strong of herself. And she's made to believe that she needs that other person to make decisions for her, to complete her. And those are things that are predatory. Somebody is actually doing something to another individual to gain control of their life and behavior. And then this makes that person feel good about themselves.
Right.
And I think sometimes it's a self-esteem issue that you have somebody that you think could be better than you or ends up with more potential than you, and you want to bring them down to their level. Right. So those are things that continuously happen. And we're dealing with it. We deal with it on an ongoing basis, but what we need to do as support is to let them know that we're here for them, that we're not abandoning them. Sometimes they feel because we don't understand them that we're not going to be around for them, but that we're there for them on an ongoing basis, and that at any time that they need them to call us, that we'll be available. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that strikes in the back of their mind a little bit, and eventually they wake up. Something happens to them that they wake up, and then they start making, let's make a phone call, and they start having this conversation. It's a long conversation.
Right. And I like how you pointed out that you can be a really strong person and still fall victim to this. I think that's a misconception that people have, that it's only, weak individuals, but this can happen to anybody.
Yeah, and it has to do with the constant messaging that victims of domestic violence receive from the perpetrator. So right. they are repeatedly told that they're worthless, or that they can't do anything right, or no one else would want you, or and so it's a normal human response that after you hear a message so often, to start to internalize it. And so, to respond to a question that you asked earlier, women will often not necessarily even recognize that they're a victim of domestic violence, because they will be blaming themselves. Like, I obviously did something to deserve this, or, right. They don't necessarily recognize that, that the intimidation or the being demeaned is a form of violence.
Right.
And
I feel like this is the $1 million question. How can you get through to somebody and make them realize, without pushing them to the other side of the fence, where you don't want them to, if stuff really, really goes downhill, you don't want them to feel like they can't come talk to you because, you'll have that "I told you so" mentality. I guess that's more for the general public. You both, as case managers, have a better understanding. But if you had to give advice to people who are listening, how can you get through to people?
So for me as a non-professional, and Sylvia is the more qualified person, but for me is that we don't make anybody anything, right? So we don't make them go through this, we don't make them do that. So we have conversations with individuals on what's going on. So the person that's going through this, they know that their safety, they know themselves well enough so that when they're able to have a conversation with you, you show support. You're understanding, and then you let them be heard. So the difference is in a lot of these situations that they have, the perpetrator has removed so many of their friends and family that the only person they're listening to is that individual. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that whatever that individual tells this person, that's the truth. So that's the only conversation that they're having is with that individual. So my job as a person that cares and a person from the community that understands this is to be able to sit there, talk to them, and understand them, and then actually let them know that I heard what they said to me. So sometimes when you verbalize it, then they say, "Oh, he gets it." Mm-hmm. And then being a male, it's even stronger because a lot of males, she thinks that the males don't hear her and they don't understand what's going on. So it's a little bit stronger when you reply or say back what they just told you in your way, and then they understand that you get them.
Yeah.
So it's helpful.
How about you from a professional perspective?
Yeah, so I was thinking back to when I was a brand new social worker here at Catholic Charities, and one of my very first clients was a victim of domestic violence. And so I thought, all right, well, I just need to call the domestic violence hotline to find out what I need to say to this woman to make her leave this man. And was, somewhat disillusioned when they told me that there was no magic, saying.
Right.
But that my role was to be a presence to her, to trust that she knew what she was doing. Right. So one of the things that when we see domestic violence, of course, we don't want someone in that situation. We don't want someone harmed, but we don't know all of the details, right? And so it's the woman in that situation that really knows her situation, because when women leave a domestic violence situation, it's the point at which in the relationship they are most at risk of physical harm and of being killed. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we need to trust that if the woman is staying, it's because it's in her interest to stay at that time.
Right.
But from a professional standpoint, what we need to work on is their sense of their self, right? And to be a counterpoint to all of the messaging that they're hearing from the abuser. So just tying this into Respect Life Month, we need to recognize that this victim is a child of God, and she needs to hear that. Yeah. You are worthy of better treatment than this. You are a worthy person just because God created you. You have skills and talents and wonderful aspects of your life that aren't being fulfilled as a result of this. And so if we can counter all of the negative messaging, the hope is that inspires some action on her part to seek something better for herself.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you tied, our faith into this too, recognizing the human dignity in everyone, just like Respect Life Month. And
we've been talking for a while now, and we've often been referring to the victim as a woman, but the reality is it does go in the other direction as well, to a much smaller percentage. But there are male victim, female perpetrator, and is it a different scenario? Does it manifest differently for men who are victims?
Well, so I guess what manifests differently is that oftentimes the response to the man is very different, right? So if we hear that a woman is being hit by a partner, we're much more sympathetic. But men often are criticized for not being manly enough, or allowing this. So that messaging is the same. How do you allow this to happen to you? But I think the way that our society looks at men who are abused is very different than it is women. There's much more. There's much less tolerance for men accepting that kind of behavior. But to your point, so we don't actually know for sure any of the statistics, because it is such a private issue that we know that domestic violence goes underreported, across the board. But the belief is that victims are probably around 95% women, as opposed to men, except in same-sex relationships.
And that's another point too, that same-sex relationships have this as well. It's not, and we've talked about it certainly from a gender perspective, and we've been talking about intimate partners as part of this, but domestic violence also affects children. Grandparents, parents. We've seen certainly stories of violence of children caring for their elderly parents, but it's taking advantage of them at the least and harming them at the worst, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess and I think Mary alluded to this a little earlier. We talked a little bit about how do we interact with someone that is in a relationship like that, but how do we perceive what are the warning signs that we need to be looking at, maybe in our own personal lives, but also with the people around us? Like, how will we recognize that someone's in an abusive relationship or is a victim?
Well, so of course there are sometimes very obvious signs, so if there are bruises, unexplained injuries, things like that, that's more obvious. But if you're, if you have a friend or a family member that you used to spend a fair amount of time with, and all of a sudden they're spending less time with you, that can be a red flag. If all they talk about is their partner and what their partner said, that can be a warning sign as well. Things, little things like, well, my husband has the credit card, he won't let me use it. Those are kinds of warning signs that, we might want to explore a little bit more.
And I think that if you're looking at church, right? When we're sitting in the pews and you see somebody that's just become or is becoming a little bit more sullen all the time, and a little bit more quiet and a little bit more distracted from the activities that they used to participate in, checking their cell phones all the time, needing to answer a text message. As soon as it dings, they have to reply back. Those things are part of someone that's trying to dominate a relationship and keep control of them. So what's happening with the text messages is that they're keeping check on whatever it is that they're doing at the time. And maybe this individual might even be outside in their vehicle or in a car outside just waiting for them. And as soon as the church service is over and everything, bam, they have to go with them. But again, we have to be there. We acknowledge them. that what's going on, we don't say it out loud. Because we don't know in what stage of the relationship this individual is in, or what could happen if we feed them a little bit more information that they're ready for.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about, how you respond when somebody talks to you first, but correct me if I'm wrong, did we get into how would you approach someone if you did see the warning signs that you all just mentioned? How do you even initiate a conversation like that? Or do you wait for them? Like, what's the best way of going about that?
Well, I usually, my thing is, I just saw you and everything is all right. That's one question. And then their brain starts acting out, that they become defensive a little bit or something like that. And you're just saying, just making sure that everything is okay with you. Let me know if you need any help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think too, it certainly depends on what your relationship is with that person. How much you might want to push a little bit more. Obviously, if it's a close family member or what have you, might feel a little bit more freedom to probe a little bit more. But really, it's just opening up the door, letting people know that you can tolerate the answer if you're going to ask the question. How are you doing? Is there anything that you need?
Yeah.
Because I know it's a difficult decision for a person to make who is in that relationship and is the victim, the person who's receiving some form of an assault, whatever it is, whether it's psychological, physical, sexual. There's so many different ways, financial. That I know it can be difficult for them to respond to an initial inquiry, but that over time they may become more open if you show openness to them. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's such a tricky business because you also don't want to make life worse for them. If it's a husband who has a problem with their wife talking to other men, it could be problematic if I go forward and if the husband were to see me interacting with the wife. So, right. It does require some forethought. But, Sylvia, in a situation like that, would I be better served not interacting and maybe getting somebody else I know, a woman to talk to who I think is a woman in distress? Yeah.
So again, it could differ from scenario to scenario, but women are often perceived as less threatening to a man. However, a man might also see that a woman might be empowering, and not just a potential threat to the relationship. But
it's such a tricky subject.
It's a tricky subject.
And I know apocryphally, I've heard of different scenarios that women or actually any victim in distress can take advantage of. There are bars, particularly in New York City, so there's several where if you say a certain phrase to the bartender, they'll separate you from whomever you're with and find you and take care of you and call a cab or a cop if you need one. Can you talk about some of the services that exist now for victims? Like are there phone numbers? Are there email? Are there websites I can go to learn more?
Yeah. So there are multiple hotlines. So every county has a domestic violence hotline. There's a New Jersey domestic violence hotline, and there's a national hotline as well. All of which are, I believe, on our website, right, Mary?
Yep. CatholicCharitiesCamden.org. If you go there, you'll see something right on the front page that links to all these resources.
Yeah. So,
and certainly they can call 911 too.
They
right?
Absolutely.
That's
and that's encouraged. If violence is occurring or is imminent, we encourage women to call, or any victim to call 911. The police will respond immediately. And as Jose said, they are better trained than they used to be. Unfortunately, not as well trained as we would want them to be, but much better than it used to be. It used to the police used to respond to it as though it was a private matter, and often leave the victim with the perpetrator to experience even greater violence subsequently. But
and I feel like the challenge, it's one thing to make somebody realize that they are being abused, manipulated, controlled. Like, that is sometimes, I imagine, a colossal undertaking to even make them understand. But then when it comes to leaving, especially if kids are involved, if somebody doesn't have any money, any family because they've been isolated, is that kind of the next hardest part? Is, okay, well, what on earth? It's one thing if you finally get to the point where you realize I am being abused, but then comes the next part. Now what do I do? How do I even go about leaving?
No, Sylvia, and then you could go to the professional stuff. Is that one of the things that the conversation was happening was that if we have someone that goes and asks the question, how are you doing? These individuals need to be prepared to listen and to accept what is being told to them, because what happens is it was like, I am so sorry, this sounds like a personal matter and everything, that survivor or victim at the moment is just going to shut down and not going to share any information. As we are able to share information, we just send this individual to someone that's trained, like one of the people that work in the domestic violence shelter, or even Sylvia Loumeau. And then it's actually strategies on survival. What do you do to survive if you're actually attempting to leave? Sometimes they attempt to leave numerous times before actually they end up, right? And then this is a survival mode for the individual. If I leave, something happens to my kids. If I leave, something happens to my dog or my cat, and so on. So there's always the conversation that they may come back. That they will come back, and eventually they'll get it. But they are trained professionals that have some ways of knowing and walking someone through an exit plan, for lack of better words.
So I had two thoughts to answer your question. One is, way back when I started here at Catholic Charities, domestic violence was not something that we probed for in our counseling department. And so we were under this misconception that it didn't exist. If people didn't tell us, then it didn't exist. Right. And the second that we decided maybe we should ask, all of a sudden we started to find out just how significant an issue domestic violence was. And I did a training of deacons several years ago and encouraged them, if couples are coming to you to ask about domestic violence, and they were very hesitant also, and soon discovered when they started asking, they started finding out, right? So it's an important question to be asking, and to Jose's point, if we're going to ask, we're going to find out that it exists, and we need to be prepared to deal with it. But Mary, to your question, leaving, and of course, when we find out that it exists, again, we want to create safety for people, and our thought automatically is we need to get them out of this situation, and we do. However, domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness in our country.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that.
And so, we have to take into consideration there are so many factors to consider. We can't just say you need to leave that relationship and not be able to do something about it.
And that's when we hear, why don't they just leave?
Why don't they just leave? Right. And why don't they just leave? Because they won't have access to an income. To feed their children if they leave, because
no house.
They won't have a house. Where will they go? So there's any number of reasons why victims choose to stay, and we need to, honor that, and then assist with it, right? So if housing is the barrier, how do we find the person housing so that they can leave and have a safe place to go? If they're worried about, because and Jose's example is a good one. Sometimes the perpetrator will threaten their pets or their children. How do we make sure that the pet or the child is going to be safe if they leave the
Right.
situation.
And that's why it just kills me when I hear people, it seems so obvious, just leave. But, from what you're saying, it's so much more complicated.
It's a complex issue.
Leaving their community is also difficult because now they have to leave the community. They're going to have school issues for the children, daycare issues. To some extent, they probably don't have any work experience, there's no savings either. So what happens? And those are really hard questions to deal with.
And if I can just, so the question, and it's a natural question to ask, why does a victim stay? And there's any number of reasons why they stay, but the question that often gets overlooked is, why does the perpetrator batter in the first place?
Right.
And so this and it speaks to the church's response to domestic violence, right? So our goal is not to break up families or to create divorces. If at all possible, our goal is to try to keep families unified. So we need to take a look at why the perpetration is taking place. And the victims will often think, well, it's because I came home late or dinner was not on time, or, and that's not the answer. The answer is that there's often an insecurity on the part of the perpetrator. There's a fear that they won't be able to survive without the victim, right? So there's this emotional insecurity that we need to address. And if we can separate a family temporarily to try to look at both, to help the victim to raise her self-esteem, but also to look at the self-esteem of the perpetrator, so that he can realize that maybe she would choose the relationship without being forced into the relationship, and create safety. We might be able to bring the family back together, which, ultimately is our goal.
And that was one of the things that really impressed me about the Batterers program that I was a part of before. It was a strange experience. It was certainly a strange experience to market it, but it was even more stranger experience to sit in on some of the group sessions that were held with the batterers, so that I could get a feel for what the program was like. But it was their self-realization that number one, they were the cause, that number two, there was probably an underlying cause that they themselves had been victims much earlier. We talk about this cycle of violence that occurs in this situation. But truly the mind-blowing part was when at the end of the program, or the program cycle for the batterers that I was that I had been following, was that the realization and so it was basically a graduation program where they would get a certificate and they would suddenly understand, and you would have a conversation with them where they were articulating all the things that they had done wrong, that they had come to the realization that they had been such a massive problem for this, and that their hope had been from the very beginning that they were going to be able to go back into an intact family. And it was impressive. Now, I don't know what the statistics were in terms of success of those programs, but I had been at these graduation ceremonies, and oftentimes their family was there that had been the victims of their battering, and it was truly a beautiful thing to see that the family actually had a desire to remain intact. So, it's going back to what Sylvia said. You really do need to take a holistic look at this and see it from a 3,000 foot level to really get an idea. Now, there are certainly situations where there'll never be reunification. There shouldn't ever be reunification. Right? But there can be cases where this is something that could happen, which is why you need trained professionals like Sylvia Loumeau and all the other people out there who really understand this situation. And sometimes lawyers need to be involved, and sometimes the police has to be involved. But there is a process, and it is getting better, right, Sylvia? I mean, you've been a caseworker, a social worker now for how long?
30
long time.
More years than I want to say.
But which is good, because she's definitely got the background in this. But I think you can say that while certainly there are just as many cases as there probably were back in the day, and certainly made worse during the pandemic, that there are much greater resources and much greater training, and there's much better understanding than there ever was at the very beginning.
Yeah, and I'll use this as a plug, Mike, to use a phrase that I talked to you about before, and that is trauma, right? So we need to take a look at the trauma of the victim and the family, but also of the perpetrator and what they're, we can't look at it. We can't define someone just by one aspect of their lives. We need to look at them holistically and see that there's a root cause for the choice to use violence to resolve an issue.
Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank the two of you for coming in. Sylvia and Jose, you're always welcome on the podcast, and you're always a delight. We don't have you here nearly enough. Mary, thank you for setting this all up.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, I hope you appreciate this episode. I hope it was enlightening for some of you. And by all means, I hope you'll keep an eye out for domestic violence that might be in and around you in your own lives. So have a great day, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.